Hey guys, Sebastian from Madrigal here. This is Traction Point. It's a game I'm developing using my own engine and tools. And this is the demo level, the first area in the game to be decorated. If you've seen any of my recent videos, you've no doubt seen this area. There's quite a lot of content there showing how this area was designed, how assets were created, etc, etc. So do go check that out if you're interested. We can see here that not all areas in the level are decorated. Here we have some pretty big single-colored block-out mountains in the background, etc. But this area right here is rapidly approaching the look and feel that I want for the game. There's something missing though. The ground looks kind of meh. We can paint different colors onto the ground, we can map textures onto them, etc. And we have some different physical materials, but it doesn't really look like different materials. It sort of looks like painted plastic or something. I mean, sure, it's green, but it's just green because I've selected a green color. It doesn't really look like grass or anything. So we need to do something about that. We need to introduce some kind of grass rendering. And grass rendering has been sort of a bugbear to me for some time now. I never really gotten it to look all that nice, work all that well, be all that easy to put into the levels, etc. If you've seen my previous Project Slide, you might remember that I used meshes for the grass there. Grass tuft meshes. They were kind of nasty to work with and required a lot of work to actually place in the level. They were sort of performance heavy and they didn't look very nice. So I set out to build a better system, or at least a system better suited for this particular game. And I'd like to show it to you today. But as with almost every single video that I put out, these things are really sort of hot off the press. So I hope we don't get any crashes. I hope things don't break spectacularly. They very well might. And the system might and probably will change quite a bit before the game is out. But let's see what I did. Shut down the game and go to the editor. And so the new system is based on something called shell texturing. So what is that? Let's create a layer for our grass here. We can set that to auto load. Save the level. We have a new object type called shell grass. I'll bring that up a little bit. Represented by this icon here. You can see that when we select it, we get a bunch of blue lines, so-called cell grid lines. We can turn those off for now. We also get this white box, which represents the bounding volume for this particular grass object. So grass is managed by these objects. You can have several of them in the level. You can duplicate this and create another one. Let's see. This over there, and now we have this one over here. They can both exist in the level at the same time. But for now, let's have just one. And the grass that you paint for this particular object needs to be placed inside this volume. You can make the volume larger if you want to. You can make this 200, for example, and so on. But that's important to know that we're working within the confines of this bounding volume here. All right. So how do we create grass? Well, quite simply, we go into edit mode and we start painting. And as I'm sure you'll see, it's quite difficult to see the grass when you're painting it. And that's sort of an artistic deliberate choice here. You can see that something is going on here with the shadow, But the grass material that I'm using is picking up the colors of the terrain and making it kind of difficult to see what is what. And that is, of course, the idea with this, that the grass is supposed to be sort of a part of the underlying terrain, not like a separate mesh on top of the thing. I do, however, have another material here that should make it a little easier to see what is going on. So let's use that. And now if we start painting again, let's bring down the strength quite a bit, and maybe even the radius. We start painting here, you can hopefully get a better idea of what is actually going on. So this is blue, specifically because I want it to stand out. Right, so here we can see the individual shells of this shell texturing technique. So one shell is essentially one layer of this pie. You can think of these shells as sort of like a stack of pancakes on top of each other. And you can make those pancakes larger or smaller, and the height of whatever you are painting, in this instance grass, but it could be mud or it could be whatever else, the height of that object is determined by how many of those pancakes or shells we have on top of it, or on top of each other. Here you can immediately see a limitation of this technique. If we move the camera close enough, you can see that we can essentially see right through the mesh, see right through this object. We do actually tessellate the mesh, and it follows the shape of the underlying terrain, so you can't typically see through the entire thing because it's curved. But for these shorter objects or shapes here, you can definitely see through the volume. And here we can start to erase some of these things. We can essentially like cut a hole into this whole thing. And now we reach the bottom. And this can all now be done without adding or removing any geometry from the mesh. So what does the mesh actually look like? Let's have a look. You can turn on wireframe. You can see here that, oh, okay, it's just essentially a grid. Or rather, it is a grid, but we have many grids on top of each other. You can see the individual shells. And then when we cut down into the thing, you can see these shells sort of being cut off depending on the painting value. But the underlying mesh is exactly the same, never changes. We can, however, change it in various different ways. First of all, you can move this whole thing. So if we move it, it will pick up whatever is underneath it and snap to that, essentially. Currently, we have it set to only pick up the terrain. If we wanted the thing to go sort of on top of that rock there, for example, what we can do is, let's see, can I copy the name of this rock? And put it in here. And now you can see that now the mesh considers that and tries to snap to that instead. Sometimes things sort of poke through a little bit, and if they do that, you might have to up the tessellation resolution a little bit. So let's make that 16, and now you can see that now it is better at actually mimicking the shape of whatever is underneath it. Still not perfect, but that's typically not really a problem with something like grass, which is not going to be like a continuous blob of things anyway. But yes, we can control the tessellation. We can make it really high or really low. Make it something like 2. Like so. And now, if we turn on this cell grid again, you can see that the whole volume is divided into cells. Currently it's set to 8 by 8. We can make it like 3 by 4, for example. If I can type. Like so. And each cell will become its own mesh when we're actually rendering these things in the game. So now that we have the tessellation set down to 2, it essentially means that each cell has just 2 vertices along each axis. Make it 4, now we have 4, etc. Put it back down to 8. Right. So this should give you a pretty good understanding of shell texturing, its strengths, its weaknesses, and so on. Here we now have the max grass height set to 1. That would be 1 world unit or 1 meter in the world of Traction Point. That means that if we paint this, go back into paint mode, and we paint here, let's make the strength 1, we reach that max height and then we can't go any further, right? So that would mean I'm gonna erase some of this here to have like a blob here which is uniformly max height essentially, like so. We have this thing here. This is now at max height. We can change the max height to be 2, for example, or 4. And you can see that if you make something that's really tall, things sort of start to break down. You can't really use shell texturing for very tall objects because if you move the camera down, you can clearly see through the thing. I now have the backface culling turned off, which means that we can see the underside of those shells as well. But if you don't have that, then the whole thing essentially sort of disappears. Now that can be remedied a little bit by adding more shells. So currently we have max shell count set to 32. We can make that 64, and we get more shells here. But still we have the same problem, and it's sort of like it's a balancing act of like how tall do you want things to be while still looking good and being reasonably performant. Now this technique is usually pretty performant when it comes to raw performance, runtime performance. But depending on what you are rendering, there might be a fair bit of overdraw. This doesn't have very much overdraw, this material, because it renders sort of solid shapes. But if you have grass, then there can be quite a bit of overdraw, which means that this is not free. You sort of need to take that into account. And that's why we have levels of detail. So you can see that when we move away, or I'm hoping you can see it, it might be a little difficult to see. Right over here, you can see that we actually have levels of detail here, which brings down the number of shells to half, and then finally to a fourth. So now you can almost like count the levels there. There should be 8. And now when we move closer, boom, we get more. And then we get even more when we get closer. Now we're up to the maximum 32 again. So that's important to keep in mind. You can also see the number of shells increasing and decreasing from the top, because it generally means that you get more or less detail over time. And the level of details are also handled per cell. So we have cell and we have shell. Kind of confusing perhaps. A cell is one of these cells here in this grid, this two-dimensional grid, which is always looked at from the top, from the perspective of the system. That's a cell, and a shell is then one of these pancakes, essentially. Right. So let's get back to the grass. Put in the grass material, and you can see that it almost sort of vanishes. And that is, as I mentioned previously, that is indeed kind of the point here. It should not be super obvious that, oh, okay, that part of the level has grass and that part does not. if it melts into the background, it also makes it relatively easy to quite simply cull these things away at a distance, because we don't need to render them very far. But it should be very obvious when you actually put something into the grass that there is grass. Put something like this, and you can see that, oh, it kind of falls into the thing. We can do this, and we can simulate physics here, and it kind of falls there into the grass. Sure, we can accept that. Let's go back to the grass here and bring down the max grass height to 1, because I think that is probably what we will be using in the game. We can put in a person here to sort of get us an idea of the scale. So this guy is now standing on the ground, and he has grass up until his hands, roughly. So you can see that we have some artifacts here, and these are kind of tricky to get completely rid of when you're using shell texturing. And it's sort of like a look that you kind of just have to accept, at least to a certain degree, when using this technique. And I've sort of accepted that this will be a look, this will be a part of the traction point look at this point. We can do a little bit to try to alleviate that, add more shells where we are able to maybe have a bit more aggressive LODing. That remains to be seen. But you will no doubt see a little bit of this sort of striped look when playing around with grass in this game. Now, there are some interesting things about this shader. First of all, you will notice that it actually picks up the color of the terrain. So if you start painting here, for example, it's going to edit, and we start painting here, we get red grass. Oh, I think that the boundary ends there, so you can see I can't paint outside of that object. It was a little poorly placed, perhaps. But I think the point comes across quite nicely anyway. Here we get red grass, here we get sort of like a whitish grass, then you have the green one. So it blends very nicely with the underlying terrain. And it looks really quite good when you are looking at it from different directions or when you're driving through it. Another thing that's kind of interesting is let's paint ourselves a big patch of grass here. Like this. And then we'll place a scout vehicle right in the middle of it. Actually, not in the middle of it. Let's place it there. And go into the game. Gonna bring the volume down to not interfere with the demo. So there's our vehicle. We can switch to that. Because this technique is sort of based on textures, you can see that we can actually relatively easily make the tire tracks cut into the grass. Here we can see it from the underside, which means that this works very naturally with other texture-based effects, such as the tire track map, which means that we can sort of erase grass, at least temporarily. And over time it will sort of fade back in. Which we can see here if we look at this for a little while. As the tire track map fades out, there we go, now the grass is kind of growing back in, so to speak. But it's a kind of nice little touch. You can actually see almost as if the wheels had flattened the grass at that position. Like so. And I really didn't have to do anything special to make that happen. Just read the tile track map and subtract that from the actual grass. Now, you need to massage this a little bit. Here you can see that the grass doesn't really look all that nice when put on top of this rock here. I would probably go in and try to paint it only in certain places, maybe tessellate the underlying mesh a bit differently, or maybe perhaps even rotate the rock a bit differently. But for many cases, or many meshes, it actually looks really nice and works quite well. So, that is kind of an overview of the grass system and how it works. Now I will jump forward in time a little bit. There will be a small cut here. Alright, so here we are back in the level. There's now grass in most of the decorated parts of the level. So let's see, we have 6 of these objects here. You can see their icons here. I think one of them is actually under the ground there. And we have grass in basically the entire decorated section of the map. So this is what it looks like when you apply this stuff to like a large portion of the map. It looks quite nice. It looks quite nice and it works quite well with this art style. Occasionally you can see a little bit of this striped look here. You can see here against this rock, for example. But like overall it looks kind of nice and it works even at a distance. You get like a little bit of detail there against things. One of my absolute favorite things about this grass is how well it actually masks the seams between meshes and terrain. So if you come here and we just toggle off the shell grass, you can see that there's a very hard seam here between, you have the terrain here and you have the mesh here. And it's surprisingly difficult actually to get rid of completely, unless you make a tool that specifically matches like vertices and normals and all of that. You put grass on top of it and you can't really see it. Now of course you can see it like a border here between where there is grass and there's just this low poly mesh, but that at least is sort of more deliberate. That's a more artistically deliberate choice to have it that way. So, pretty cool. Pretty cool. We have some areas here where we have some sort of strangely colored grass. Like here, for example, I've just painted a bunch of, I guess, dried grass or whatever you want to call this to this area. Same here. I think this just sort of looks kind of interesting. Doesn't necessarily look very realistic, but it looks like it could perhaps fit in this world. This is a sci-fi world anyway. A fictional sci-fi world doesn't need to adhere to the laws of physics. Here's a pretty interesting look when we have a little bit darker terrain underneath. You get these nice shadows here coming through. And yeah, I think this kind of just looks pretty nice. In some cases here you see this grass is sort of like a little artificially lit perhaps. There's a really good place up here to actually see it. Like the grass kind of looks a little too bright to be realistic. And that is because we haven't light mapped this area yet. I will do light mapping reasonably soon when I cover all of the different forms of indirect lighting that we will use in this game. So video coming up soon, be sure to check that out. And the grass is designed to work with light maps as well. I haven't really tried that in like a larger context, so I need to make sure that actually works, but that should make areas like this nicely darker. Make sure that the grass sort of fits in those places a little better than it currently does. So let's have a quick playthrough and see how this actually works. And how it feels. I think like just the idea of having a bit more sort of micro detail on the side just makes the whole area feel more believable in some sense. It doesn't look like it's just like a piece of plastic that's been colored differently in different areas. This actually kind of looks like it could be a real place in some heavily stylized universe. Again, we see some of that striping there, and you can most easily see it when you actually have like the vehicle's shadow contrasted against the grass. And yeah, maybe I'll come up with something to make that a little less visible. Otherwise, it will just be a part of this game's look, I think. So here we now have 6 of these areas, some of them overlapping a little bit with one another. Remains to be seen how performant this is when we fill a whole level with it. I'd say that we have about maybe a third or a fourth of this level now covered in grass. The rest is still, well, undecorated, and there's lots of things missing from those other areas of the level, but I have my editor renderer is doing things in the background. That's why I get a little bit of stuttering. But yeah, that remains to be seen how well this actually performs when we have the whole level decorated. So far it looks pretty good, and like I said, we can actually just cull this stuff out if it is far enough from the camera without ever really seeing any difference at all. Which I can demonstrate by looking at this area here, for example, and sort of turning it on and off. Yeah, there's a little bit of difference, which we might even be able to fade away with distance. But yeah, that's it basically for the terrain grass technique used for Traction Point, at least until I come up with a better system. I think this is kind of nice because it's relatively easy now to paint things in. You just need to make sure that you have the area covered, and then you start painting. And it makes things look natural in a way that they weren't before. And it just looks very fluffy and nice. Kind of just want to lie down in it. Anyway, that's it for this time. If you like this video, then by all means feel free to like the video. If you like this kind of stuff in general, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, write them below. Always fun to read those. I'm pretty sure that I will cover global illumination, indirect lighting, whatever you want to call it, next, or at least very soon. So if you're interested in that, make sure to stay tuned. We'll see how the grass behaves when it is put into a fully light mapped environment. A little nervous about that, but we'll see. Maybe it'll work out just fine. Until then, have a good one, and hope to see you in the next video. Bye.